So everyone, thanks for coming. We're very happy here to host Phil Neel for a conversation with us on communism, strategy, revolution. Hope we can take a few gentle steps in that direction in this conversation. Phil has recently released an incredible book, which I'm currently in the process of reading through, which is Hellworld, which is a gargantuan analysis of global capitalism, industrial infrastructure across the globe, and the problem of political subjectivity in this context. He's also written Hinterland, and there are a series of essays of his, which you can find, more specifically, one that relates to the present conversation, which is the theory of the party, which was published in the Ill Will uh, website. His Substack is also amazing. I really recommend it for you all. Lots of theory drops discussions that are very exciting. And I think the idea was like just having the opportunity, because I think that for us here in the STP, CSTP, or whatever our current name is, uh, I think Phil's work really resonates with a lot of our perspectives. So I was very curious. That's why we thought about the invitation of how this conversation could go. I think there's lots of points of connection, especially because I think that, especially when we try to face, I think, the conjunctural analysis and see the scale of our problems, it can be very daunting. So I think it's very important and relevant the fact that in his work, I think the communist hypothesis is very much alive and working in reading through the events that are unfolding. So I think we can start with your initial remarks, and then we can go on from there. Once again, thank you for coming. Thank you everyone for joining also. Hope we have a good time.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm going to keep my initial remarks pretty concise and then I think drive it with the Q&A to get into some more detail because there is kind of a lot of different angles and different kind of directions to go in. I have the piece that you talked about, Theory of the Party on Ill Will, which was sort of center the discussion. I also have a forthcoming piece on this outlet called Heatwave Magazine, which is, I think it'll be out this summer sometime in print first and then later online, um, which talks a little bit in a little bit more granularity about questions of organization rather than the more abstract theory of the party. So I'll be sort of positioning the talk today in between those two things. And I'll be bringing up some of the topics, as was mentioned, like that I've talked on about on my Substack, which is the Planetary Factory, or just my name, Phil Neel, Substack. In particular, there's a piece called Masses, which talks a little bit more about like Badiou and contextualizes some of the stuff from Theory of the Party. So, uh, the big thing that I'd like to really start with is this question actually that I posed before any of the questions of these more recent things on theories of political partisanship, organization, et cetera, et cetera. More this thing that comes from the larger book project, Hellworld, this idea that there's this sort of all-encompassing planetary society driven by its own distinct social logic, right, which is the logic of the value form, the law of value, the imperatives imposed on daily life by accumulation. Um, and part of those imperatives is also the fact that even though this society is planetary and includes an enormous portion of the human species, right, within the proletarian class, it does not uh, it does not simply unify labor through that process. It both unifies and it dismembers labor, right? There's this very key thing in Marx's work, if you look at the drafts of Capital between the Grundrisse and what he finally decides to print in Capital, there's a key passage which in Hellworld I sort of put them back to back. And it's this passage on the collective laborer, right? And in the Grundrisse, in these early drafts, it's fairly optimistic in many respects. It is something where he emphasizes the unification that is wrought through the development of the productive forces and the development of the division of labor. He emphasizes this kind of optimistic teleological aspect of it in that initial passage. But then in those intervening years, he chips away at that and completely restructures this passage to emphasize the division in the division of labor and the dismemberment of productive subjectivity and the fact that in the creation of this large international production system, people's interests are actually divided against themselves, even while they are within the same class, right? So this, I think, is the central, one of the really central points that I'm kind of grappling with in Hellworld is we have this dynamic that brings people together all across the world in these chains of production, these very material ways, right? That puts them into contact with each other, that makes them coordinate with one another, learn all kinds of kind of abstract new forms of knowledge that are synthesizing social reality, like in a very literal sense, synthesizing the materials of society, but also synthesizing like these social forms just actively, right, through this process in the division of labor. At the same time, this same process is driving those dynamics of division and separation and national difference and racialization and all of those things that subdivide the working class, as well as these occupational divisions, which are extremely familiar for anybody trying to, like all of these divisions are the things that you first confront when you try to actually organize, right? When you try to go and do anything, you realize, oh, well, who's really on my side in this struggle?
Travou, né? Acho que caiu. Está demorando para voltar?
Sorry, I think
Back.
that Zoom kicked me off because my VPN was on.
Ah.
So
Oh, it
I
took a
turned my
while.
VPN. Yeah, I don't know why I didn't do it earlier, but that's what I suspect happened. I turned it off now, so hopefully we should be
Okay.
good. Um, so when we're kind of actively organizing, the first thing that we really confront, right, are these divisions, not this kind of abstract unity, but the fact that some people kind of share very similar localized interests and some don't. Um, these occupational divisions are particularly important if any for anyone trying to do like workplace organizing. These are the things that you kind of immediately realize that shop floor workers are going to have different immediate interests than the design and engineering workers, than the managerial workers kind of above them, and of course different than like the people doing like the finance behind the scenes of the firm. But then they'll also have potentially very distinct interests from migrant workers who are doing janitorial work at the same facility, right? So these divisions are very salient. These divisions are also tend to be where we kind of ideologically focus in a lot of our attention when we discuss questions of political organization. The question becomes, there's a chapter in Hellworld that sort of talks about how many of these things are kind of conventionally presented, In a lot of like left, your conventional leftist accounts often go something like, well, we need to find this vanguard demographic, essentially. And that vanguard demographic would be maybe traditional working class in some vision, or a peasantry, or the lumpen urban underclass, whatever. Um, Often it kind of amounts to this idea, especially today, narrated in the forms of like finding like the most oppressed, or those with the most intersectional experiences of oppression, right? And organizing with them on their behalf, doing inquiry into their lives, et cetera, et cetera. However, we kind of conceive of organization, it focuses on finding this kind of special demographic, right? This magical demographic group that is produced uh, by the forces of production themselves, right? Um, by these dynamics that create kind of our social world, and which is endowed with some sort of special power. And it's a little bit different exactly what that special power is in each of these accounts, right? How it's justified. But this propels a lot of this kind of less leftist narrative of organizing with or on behalf of, the working class or any given particular community, and then who represents that, who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is basically that there is some sort of demographic group, there's some sort of body, right, that is created through the forces of production, creating some sort of special productive subjectivity that then naturally engenders a revolutionary subjectivity, right? And when we talk about subjectivity here, we're talking about these collective things, not just individual consciousness, but like collective forms of consciousness and action. Um, so that's basically kind of the idea, is that you can find this kind of particular demographic that kind of maps on in some way, right? And I draw from Badiou, of course, but also from Neocosmos in arguing against uh, basically the core of this argument, the idea that there is some inherent one-to-one sort of creation of revolutionary subjectivity out of the development of the productive forces, and thereby the development of productive subjectivity. Instead, I basically respond to this with like a couple key points. One of the key points is simply that it doesn't, it basically, it's not that simple. That there are these net dynamics, right, in the development of the productive forces that do potentially make the emergence of revolutionary subjectivity more likely over time. And I sort of address these at the very end of the book. But they have nothing to do with producing a special demographic that is thereby kind of endowed with by the power of history to overthrow the class system. It simply doesn't work like that, is the first point, right? Um, Now, there are elements of teleological development to the social system in the sense that you can trace certain trends that are, the aggravation of contradictions, the scaling up of these contradictions, and certain psychological effects of how much more and more absurd it appears that you're like working for a wage when it becomes so much easier and easier to produce more and more basic things, right? Um, but beyond that, there really isn't, this particular kind of demographic that's produced by these dynamics. It then becomes this kind of vanguard force in and of itself because of its position within the division of labor, or because it somehow represents the proletarian experience more generally. So then the second part that I kind of add to this is this kind of, it follows from some of the emphasis on tactics and action, especially in the present conjuncture. But it's the idea that whatever section of the class, for whatever conjunctural reasons, is moving, is thrown into motion, is thrown into this forward position of conflict with the world of capital, right? And in these particular ways where it seems to have this negative capacity to it, it isn't just asking of simple concessions, but takes on this self-reflexive singularity type structure, especially with regard to political events that it emerges out of, right? When we see those things, that means that this section of the class is effectively serving as this kind of vanguard function, right? If we just understand it as this is where the conflict is, and this is the foremost point of the conflict at any given moment, right? So that's the second point, is keeping an eye out for this idea that there is this sort of potential for revolutionary subjectivity. We could call it a pre-subjective impulse or something like that. It isn't uniformly distributed either. It's not that it can be taken up anywhere and anybody could just as easily be incorporated into this revolutionary subject. No, it does require material factors, right, that then make it more and more likely. And so this is where this theory of the party comes in. And I'll summarize it kind of briefly. Of course, for the more intricate version, I would look at the article. But the basic idea is that there are these eternal dynamics, essentially. And I mean eternal, like in the sense of universal to all forms of like mm, human society that are based on domination, essentially. So it does predate capitalist society in many ways, right? But capitalist society has these particular, its particular form of domination does creates these dynamics in particular, its own particular kind of form, which we're fairly familiar with. And what happens with these dynamics is that these dynamics, these contradictions inherent to systems of social domination, they will always produce, right, this um, general social kind of level of if you can pose it as resistance of uprising of short circuits within that social logic that produce these upsurges basically of popular opposition to the prevailing order in this very kind of general sense. So I'm speaking very generally here because I think we can really extend it back to all systems of domination. But in capitalism, we're looking at some very specific things, right? These are forms of resistance that aren't simply just kind of negotiating around minor terms of life. They're things that take on some sort of self-reflexive character in the sense that you have people that begin to have some sort of struggle that, in the kind of parlance of the forces of order gets out of hand. And then once it gets out of hand, it can start to snowball in these weird ways where it no longer becomes a single struggle about one facet of life, about the gas prices being too high, the food oil prices too high, right? It becomes a general rejection of kind of stuff, right? And that's often how amorphously it is expressed. So it's not meant as kind of like a dismissive thing, but like often people are really have difficulty articulating exactly what they are opposing, but it tends to be clear that they are opposing everything, the social order, right? The way that society is run, and that might take the momentary image of, yeah, well, because society is run by politicians, we want all the politicians gone, like that sort of language that we've seen again and again over the past 30 years, right? Um, so those sort of things are constantly happening. They're constantly being regenerated by the forces of capital, right? By the force of production, by all these more granular dynamics I discuss in the book, how material development occurs, et cetera, and by these inherent contradictory dynamics within the social logic of capital, right? And within the social logic of all forms of society premised on domination, they will always reproduce these sort of dynamics in different forms that kind of relate to their unique social logics, right? And so I call this trend the historical party. And I draw this from Bordiga and from some other thinkers who originally kind of draw from offhanded comments by Marx. So there's this idea that there's just this kind of undercurrent of struggle. But the other thing is that this undercurrent does not have a steady cadence in time. It's not just always there, right? There are particular moments where you see these clusters of these upsurges becoming more intense, right? And also closer together in time and potentially closer together in space, although that one's a little bit more complicated. Um, so you see these kind of clusterings, and we usually have in the last 20 or so years, people talk about these as like cycles of struggle, right? You get these upsurges, these kind of clusters of upsurges, and they're next to each other, and then they all kind of face similar limits because they're running into similar conditions, but they're unique in their individual conjunctures for different reasons, right? Now, at the same time, taking this idea from Neocosmos, who takes it from Sylvain Lazarus, the idea that it, fundamentally we also have to remember that people are conscious agents, right? And they phrase it as like people think, right? So there is this level of agency all the way down to this individual level of people are caught up in this stuff, and they're able to see that they're caught up in it to a certain extent, right? A lot of people don't see. They're just kind of they'll go with it, they'll do the thing, whatever. They don't necessarily have a mechanism or an organization to be self-reflexive about it, but minorities of the class thrown into motion do have that self-reflexive process. They're doing things exactly like your group is doing, right? Like talking about stuff, saying, what's going on? How do we understand the present conjuncture? Oh, yeah, that's related to like the way that society is organized. How do we understand the logic of this the way that society is organized, right? So when people start to ask those sort of questions, and when people start to act in the midst of these uprisings, especially like evental scale uprisings, ones that take this general kind of rejection of society at heart, people start to act kind of in, to use the Bourdieuian phrase, in fidelity to those things. And what that means materially, right, in the midst of an uprising is people are no longer acting just to fulfill the demands that the uprising was initiated by or something like that. They're often acting simply to kind of prolong, extend, and deepen the uprising itself, the social transformation that they kind of feel themselves caught up in. They want to extend that, they want to deepen it, they want to preserve it, et cetera, et cetera. So this self-reflexive feature of those kind of eventual uprisings becomes very, very important, right? And it's also like a mass phenomenon. Many, many people are being thrown together, having their kind of ideological systems decompose in these different ways, but also hardened in maybe other ways, right? And there's this kind of active struggle going on. In consciousness, but also materially, tactically, they are out there facing the police, right? Or they're out there facing particular like arrangement of bosses, right, in an industrial struggle. And they are seeking to kind of extend the uprising itself and spread this kind of consciousness thing that's happening to them to other people. They also are seeking to overcome concrete tactical limits, right? So in doing that, they're learning all these lessons about they start to look at the last cycle of struggles or whatever and say, well, what did they deal with and how did they operate through it, right? And then they say, well, they didn't win against it. It was worse than it is now. So let's look even further back and see if we can find like a successful revolutionary struggle, right? And then they get into the process of like, I don't know, like the Communism 101 reading group about, we're going to read about the Russian Revolution, and then we're going to read about the Chinese Revolution, and we're going to read about Spain, and we're going to read, all of these sort of things. They start to inquire into that history, right? And in so doing, they begin to articulate themselves as part of this longer kind of current, right? Um, and that in that sense, they kind of regain this thing that is always projected by the historical party, this kind of invariant image of communism, both as a general projection of the world, but also as the idea that many people have fought this struggle before. And then once you start to fight in it, you realize that you have this history that has nothing to do with exactly where you are born or what language you speak, right? But does have this genuinely universal aspect to it, right? When people begin to do this, the theory of the party article is the key thing that I try to point out there is that people, regardless of whether they understand themselves as an organization and they choose a name for a little collective or something like that, they are formalizing partisan activity. As soon as they begin to do this, whether they regard it as a formal organization or not, they are engaging in the process of formalization, which is defined by this self-reflexive and individually kind of conscious aspect, but it also exceeds the consciousness of any individual engaged in it, right? Because we're collectively asking these questions. So I'm coming out of this struggle in Occupy, right? And then I'm meeting people who came out of Square's struggles in Europe. And I'm talking to them about the limits that they overcame. And that collective process then begins to build up this larger subjective capacity that's expressed in the form of what I call these formal parties. All these parties who are making these concrete kind of intellectual inquiries into their surroundings and the history of revolutionary struggle and all of that, but also B, they are tasked with very specific material interventions, right? Trying out these tactical experiments to see what sticks, either what in the midst of an uprising works to overcome the limits, or B, the other thing that happens is that after the uprising fades, these formal organs remain and they try these interventions to like revive it, to bring it back or reignite it or spread it somewhere else, or when they're being a little bit more, I think, sober after like that, the grieving has stopped, or once they get to like the healthy part of the grieving process, then they are the ones who go around and they tell people about what happened and say like, well, yeah, well, this is kind of where we got stuck, and if you had something like this happen here, you should avoid this path, et cetera, et cetera. Like that sort of attempt to sort of spread the knowledge of it, carry on that little, little bit of fire saved from the big conflagration and spread it to other people. And you can, see this again and again, like these revolutionaries from Sudan who had to flee, obviously, in the midst of the civil war, but then they are living in Nairobi or in Toronto, and they're having these events, just explaining what happened, talking about, building aid potentially for, people still doing organizing there, but also really talking about like how the revolution was defeated, right? At least in that iteration. So this process of formalization then brings together all these people in these kind of little groupuscules. They may be very informal in their own self-understanding, but they're doing this kind of formalizing activity, and some of them may turn into formal organizations. And then the final key thing that happens is that then there's eventually going to be another upsurge, right? Either there or elsewhere, like wherever they're operating or elsewhere. And when that happens, these formal organizations are then tested. Their fidelity to this historical party is tested in those moments. This is a very conventional thing that we're all probably familiar with, is when the radical organizations that were generated a decade ago, 2 decades ago, and whatever struggle was popular then, when the next uprising happens and they become conservative players in that struggle, right? They're the ones who are saying, well, no, you really just need to vote for our candidate and get off of the streets. Or they're saying, well, this is all great, but doing the rioting isn't going to do anything. What you really need to do is have just some sort of NGO type structure to like serve people in your community, right? And they try to really pull people out of this incendiary confrontation with power. That's the other key thing. That's basically the key way you can tell that they are not infidelity to the motion of the historical party any longer, is because they are no longer committed to that confrontational aspect of building communist power, even if they understand themselves as kind of building power in some other sense. If they cannot plug that into the active confrontational side of class conflict, right? Then it becomes an organ of the party of order effectively. It shuts down the confrontation in order to restore the status quo, and in their hopes to plug the energy maybe into their gradualist program to overcome whatever over a series of decades. Um, so when that happens, you see many of these formal parties basically lose their partisan status. They're no longer parties in any sense. They're proven to be nothing but these organs of, what Benji would call the situation, trying to reinforce that kind of monotonic, atonal existence that like the party of order is always saying, go back to normal. If Trump wasn't in power, we could go to brunch, that sort of logic, right? Now, the other thing that can happen, though, is that more and more formal parties. So one thing that happens is as the cadence and the intensity of these moments of upsurge increases, it's more likely to produce more of this formal partisan activity. That formal partisan activity then has a greater chance of producing more of these formal parties that survive into subsequent cycles and can subsequently intervene back into those conditions to make those upsurges a little bit more likely. I didn't really talk about that dynamic much, but that's one of the key things that former parties are trying to do, right? Is to intervene back into conditions to make a single struggle against some sort of local issue into something much larger. Um, and in the articles, I talk about these kind of internal contradictions that come out of these day-to-day subsistence struggles versus these larger kind of eventual struggles that have this mass character. I can talk about that more in like the Q&A session if we want to. But the key point is that these formal parties then can create, they're able to at a certain point, or more likely to at a certain point, create these circuits of activity between their formal activity and the energy or momentum of the historical party, they can then become self-reinforcing. And we see this in history, right? We do have historical cases of this happening. And when it happens, it are basically the traditional kind of revolutionary forms. So you see this circuit building, you see more and more of this revolutionary kind of consciousness generalizing across many organizations, not a single formal party, right? Even if there might be one big one in one particular place. And then as it begins to build up, each of these new conflagrations becomes kind of larger and more severe, severe in the sense of it touches more of society and it hurts more of the day-to-day kind of functioning of the law of value and production and all of those sort of things. And we see these things. Obviously, there's a bunch of conjunctural kind of factors or contingent factors. There's a war, there's some particular trigger, right? But even if that trigger had happened, if you hadn't had that long circuit and cycle of revolutionary activity and the building up of revolutionary subjectivity through these upsurges, you wouldn't have had the revolution be triggered by that war. It would have just been a war like it was elsewhere, where they didn't have that process, where the war in Russia, in the First World War in Russia, took a very different turn than the First World War in the US, partially for contingent reasons and the extent and the severity of the war and the level of development, right? But also partially because there hadn't been nearly as much of this process of revolutionary subjectivity kind of building for as long. And there's all kinds of reasons for that in the US, right? There was all these reactionary channels that could be pushed into. There was the racial divide. There was all this other stuff that was going on that maybe stunted it. We can imagine alternate history where that wasn't the case, but that is what happened in history, right? The revolution did happen in Russia. And then when we got maybe close to some of those triggering events in the US, it didn't happen. And then we can puzzle over why that was, right? But the idea is that when this circuit forms, and you have these many different formal parties all across the world making these interventions, trying to keep fidelity to that kind of spirit of communism, trying to intensify these events when they do erupt, trying to summon them back when they aren't there, trying to spread that knowledge and that history and that kind of universal kind of aspect of the revolutionary project. When that happens and that circuit is kind of in this kind of positive feedback loop, you start to generate this higher order form of subjectivity, which is what I call the Communist Party proper, and which is usually or conventionally, you can think of it in formal terms. It's usually we attempt to capture it, right? In the names of like internationals and the different eras of the different internationals. And those internationals represent like this broader, higher level subjectivity that the revolutionary movement had as at that time. And the other way that we capture it is just thinking of it as, a living communist movement. So we could talk about the history of the communist movement, and we all know. I mean, anyone who has a rudimentary understanding of communist history, of revolutionary history, we kind of have a feeling for when that movement was living and then when it died out. And then the question right now is, can we revive it, basically? I don't think many people, at least not many people who really understand what communism is and what the revolutionary movement was, would argue that it's living today in that same kind of sense. You have a lot of, in my opinion, what we have right now is this increasing intensity of emotion in the historical party, and we have a good number of formal party activities happening now, at least compared to 20 years ago, or even compared to 10 years ago. And they're trying to cohere something that looks more like this higher level subjectivity, but I don't think we've seen any evidence of it happening yet. We see these uprisings that the historical party, that are the evidence of the existence of the historical party. We see them hitting the same limits. We see all the Gen Z uprisings, right, hitting the same limits that the uprisings of the millennial uprisings hit in like the early 2010s in the first round of the Arab Spring. They're very, very similar limits. If anything, you see certain contours in some of the Gen Z uprisings that are even more conservative in some respects. Invocations of like hustle culture type stuff, pushes in some cases for more liberalization in the face of like corporate monopoly, corporate state military monopoly type things. And so you see, that history can go in multiple directions and that there's a lot of weight on these individual interventions that we all kind of attempt all the time. And there's kind of a tragic cast to this, which I talk about in Hellworld, of like, what do you do when you're in a really shitty situation? And the shitty situation is basically Hong Kong in 2019 is the example, because on the one side, it's isolated in some respects. On the other side, it's a huge, in terms of local intensity, it's probably the largest share of any given polity participating in a mass uprising, since like the real communes of the olden days, right? It's a huge portion of the population. I mean, just really, really astonishing how many people were engaging in very intensive conflicts with power. But then at the same time, right, it was very quickly dominated by the tactical intelligence of the far right, and that then led to their kind of ideological positions being taken up at wider and wider scales, and their language and branding being taken up at wider and wider scales. Um, and so, in the book, I talk in a lot more detail kind of about this and about like the situation faced by like communists in that sort of an uprising. But there's kind of no choice regardless. Like you still have to, you live there, this is your life, you have to participate and you have to fight against it, even if you don't really feel like you have a hope of winning in that situation, and make contingency plans and maybe plan to go into exile and all that stuff. And then you carry on, like you still learn those tactical lessons, you still spread that intelligence to people, right? So I think that Hellworld is a very, on the surface of it, it seems like a very pessimistic book. But in fact, one of the key kind of things I'm trying to really explore there, to really tease out, is like, how do you actually have this revolutionary optimism in the midst of all of these, structural forms of pessimism, and in the midst of, having to fight all these losing battles for something that always seems like a lost cause, until that lightened moment of eventual upsurge or rupture or whatever, however you want to categorize it, when for whatever reason and however it works psychologically, it does something to you, right? And it kind of does have this kind of enlightening effect. And yeah, I think we should probably just leave it there and see where people want to go with the discussion. That kind of summarizes the kind of overarching things. We could talk about a little bit more about what, like I talk a bit more in this forthcoming article about, what specific forms of day-to-day organization can be potentially useful right now. But, one of the key points of the article is that that's really hard to say in general because it's very dependent on people's specific situations. But we can talk, about some of that, or if people want to start with more of kind of the material of how this connects to productive subjectivity, the development of the forces of production, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, let's just see where people really want to go from here.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a great starter for the conversation. If anyone wants to start asking questions. I have questions, but I will leave that space for other people to I will cover the silence with me speaking anxiously while no one. Okay, so I will. I get very tense in this silent moment, so let me occupy it for a bit. I have a lot of questions, but I will start with one issue that you were talking about, and which I think it came up in the end, uh, and this is a question that I'm very interested in, and in part because of political developments in Brazil specifically, because I mean, there were these uprisings in the beginning of the 2010s, all over the country. And I mean, the eventual feeling, it was very visible and it's very difficult to communicate for people who weren't in that struggle. So, I mean, I think all that relates, and at the same time, it's very clear that uh, there is this process of accumulation that at the same time we felt wasn't enough, but at the same time there was something that allowed it to not simply be a simple cycle that extinguished itself. I mean, I think we are still, in a sense, recovering from what happened. And but I have this question, which is looking uh, at your some of your articles and your essays on Substack, also the masses one, also I think maybe, but I think in general, uh, I think that I'm very curious because it seems like the insurrectional moment as a moment which is very connected, I think, to the commune form in general. It seems to be the perspective that guides, I think, the view of the development of revolutionary struggle. And uh, I've been wondering, especially because of discussions we've been having in CSO in general and our practice. Uh, if you think that insurrection is limited to the perspective of like a mass eruption that takes people in a larger scale involving different political processes, not only one, as being like this guiding point, like this star that we can see and say, okay, this is a movement in the right direction. And I'm asking if this about this the centrality of the insurrection, at least in the process, the view of the process, because I also feel that there are these revolutionary sparks, and it's the same type of eventual feeling, I think, in a sense, where you are involved doing organizing, and it seems like for a certain moment, you are not simply responding to a problem, and to use it in your terms, to us, it's not simply a subsistence struggle, but it becomes a form of responding to communist problems, you know? So you are not simply, and I think it's the point you made is very important, which is the the struggle at a certain moment, it becomes a struggle against forms of domination in general, and then there are these certain principles that if they are not discursively present, they are there, I mean, from the practices. And I'm wondering your view of like political processes that uh, have this moment. And again, I mean, they also take the form of communes generally because they involve like the reinvention of daily life, of economic process, but they are not so explosive from a I mean, a visible perspective, you know? And I'm thinking particularly something that is not, just to take some points, it's not specifically limited to I mean, one organization. It might involve like the conjunction of many organizations, of establishing, like, for example, certain networks of exchange of economic goods that involve also the exchange of safety procedures and self-defense and cultural. I mean, it does seem like there's a flicker of communism in those in certain processes. Uh, and I'm asking these because I think that there's a huge problem, which is why I get that the insurrectional moment is important, which is normally these processes, they seem to be too small to effect a change against the value form as a form of social domination. Because I mean, even if you articulate certain territories in a struggle, you are still in a global economy, and there are still forms of this domination uh, limiting whatever can be done. But I mean, sorry for the long digression, but I was thinking about uh, this particular space for the insurrectional. Uh, if that is like the only measure, or if that's like what is, I mean, let me rephrase the last part. Why is it that you think the insurrectional is like a fundamental measure? Because I think it appears as a certain sense as a measurement of a revolutionary struggle.
Can I
Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
add something? I believe it's connected to Rafael's question. So, Phil, nice to meet you. I'm Thiago. I'm organizing your next talk on Wednesday. So it's great to be here. And I'd like to question this very point that come up in the end, and you say on day-to-day organization. Because, well, the short version of my question is somehow how to connect the uprising with this day-to-day organization. I mean, the aim of an uprising, as I can see, is to change the day-to-day, not only to be on the barricades and so on, but the day after the uprising is also essential. Um, but well, as far as I can see, the day-to-day organization is overdetermined by social forms of capitalism, and how we live in is not in the very same scale of the social form. It's like the social form dominate us, but I believe that's on the spatial level. It's where we can build on different forms of social reproduction. Um, Recently, we got this interview by Joshua Clover from Riot, and in this interview he claimed the centrality of the commune, and I recall the Christian Ross book on the commune form, and somehow also in the Paul Torino and Voleben text in You Will about the yellow vests, where they claim the centrality of this place where the people can meet up on everyday life. So somehow I would like you to develop this idea of day-to-day organization that you presented. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, this basically I think gets right at what I'll be talking about a little bit in this forthcoming article, but in some of these other sort of texts, I've talked about this tension that exists between the subsistence struggles, which in every sense really are overdetermined by the social logic of capital. They by definition are, right? And their struggles for greater wages. There's struggles which, in order to win them, you have to essentially operate, at least to a certain extent, fully within, the rules of the game, right? Um, and there are also struggles which are going to be most successful when they suppress the tendency to get out of hand, right? When they suppress that tendency to become something much larger. Although they have this kind of weird relationship as well, because they tend to be better at winning their demands when there is this opposing force that's pushing for more radical action, right? And we all know this kind of pattern as well. Um, So what kind of distinguishes these more kind of evental things from subsistence struggles, but also what is this kind of difference in consciousness or in kind of individual kind of feeling between these things? So I think I'll start with what Raphael was talking about, this kind of like we certainly do feel some of this spark in some of these things, right? And we feel good about it, and we're doing certain things. We're educating, maybe doing like educational projects, right? And we feel like we're kind of spreading that consciousness or whatever, and or we feel like we're really like building up capacity to act or something like that. Um, and I think those things are real. So on the one hand, I think we have to distinguish between people who have passed through this kind of the gate of the event, right? And who have been thrown into that sort of thing, and then are thrown into this activity, who are kind of seeking it and they know what it looks like and they kind of know some of what it feels like and they see these little elements in these day-to-day struggles. And the reason that they can see them so well is because they have seen this like thing before. They've seen this, however you want to describe it, as the indescribable light of communism peering back at us from the future, right? It appears in the event, like however we want to think of it. We've kind of seen that in some sense, or at least sensed it. And there's these little whiffs that you get of it when you go around in everyday settings doing this sort of organizing, and you kind of see people breaking down those barriers of ideology. You see capacity building for kind of revolutionary action. You see successful tactical interventions. Um, so that's one thing, I think. Now, the other thing is that for people who have not passed through the gate of the event, right, who have not actually been thrown into that feeling, they sometimes can also, I think, intuit it, or uh, those sort of activities are doing something for them as well. You can think of it, if we want to think of it again in kind of a teleological sense, we can think of it as like preparing them for the event, right? They will become more likely to participate in these eventual ruptures in this particular way when they have done certain types of things in life, right, that have predisposed them to this, whether that be being engaged in these sort of struggles or come from particular backgrounds where they've been thrown into the like conflict with the state just because of their very existence, like those sort of things will potentially predispose people to certain types of activity. And this is how we think about this weird contradiction that exists between social position, right, and the development of these larger forms of revolutionary subjectivity between kind of these ruptural moments where the purely voluntarist argument would be that they don't have any relationship, but they clearly do, right? Because you can track that, like, it is not like to take an easy one from the American context. It is not baby boomers participating in these things, which isn't to say that they didn't participate in eventual things in the past. And it's not just a fact that young people tend to do these things, because that is not universally true, right? When there was mass closure of socialist era factories in China, you had pensioners, 60, 70, 80 years old, rioting about the closure of these factories, right? And this had a huge eventual impact on later kind of reform era Maoist movements in China. So we have the idea that, like, we have the reality that there is something about social position that does predispose and prepare people for things, right? To be thrown into these upsurges of the historical party that then kind of open open this kind of vision of communism as this larger project to certain people. Now, there's also a bunch of random shit, like people who just maybe have a temperament that makes them, want to be more critical of the world or something like that. People who, for whatever reason, are involved in a bunch of weird, I don't know, they already read a bunch of weird theory or something like that just for fun because they like the literary aspect of it. Like maybe they get thrown into this, all kinds of random stuff can predispose people toward things. But that daily work part of it, I think, is also a very important aspect of people who are engaged in that sort of daily work. They may become more prepared, but they also may not. So I think we see a certain danger here, and this is the contradiction that I try to tease out in this later piece, is the fact that communists, right, formal parties of communists, however we want to think of them, people who are collectively reflecting consciously about their relationship to this revolutionary project and to these upsurges. After the upsurge ends, they're going to go and they're going to do this daily work, right? They actually have no choice. We have no choice but to engage in these subsistence struggles, even if we say, fuck it, I'm out. I don't want to be in the communist group anymore. I'm going to go back to work. You're at work, right? And you're going to get fucked over at work. And then you're going to want to organize to get more wages, to get, you are going to be forced to struggle almost regardless of where you are, right? You're going to be thrown into these sort of things. And as communist organizations, you have no choice in a deeper sense where you have to retain that connection to the class, even when it's not mobilized as, these masses in motion. It's just this day-to-day simmering of struggle. You do militant inquiry stuff. You go and you talk to people. You try to figure out what people are thinking. You try to figure out these larger like population dynamics. Where are people moving to? What's driving these sort of patterns of employment and grievances, and where might you, what you're searching for a lot of the time is where might the next upsurge happen, and when it does, how can our formal organizations or whatever have the connections and the ability and the capacity necessary to intervene in it when it happens, or at a certain point, is it possible to intervene in order to trigger these more kind of explosive upsurges? Now, in doing that, though, every communist organization is also torn. It's torn in two. It has one side where it has to be engaging in the subsistence struggle side of things, these aspects of struggle which are socially overdetermined. Um, and in order to win those battles, it has to make all kinds of concessions to that other side, which is its commitment, its fidelity to the incendiary potential that it saw in the kind of eventual rupture or whatever. So it has these two kind of aspects that it's constantly trying to balance, right? And what these aspects lead to are what traditionally in like the old tongue of Leninist Maoist parlance were rightist and leftist deviations, right? The leftist deviation being obsessing too much about the breakaway, the ruptural aspect, and then venturing into adventurous activity that is ultimately undermines the capacity to act because it gets you destroyed, or the rightist tendency, which is committing fully into the subsistence struggle in order to do it, making all these opportunist capitulations, and then becoming just a party of order that is actually suppressing the revolution, right? At different scales, either as a local little NGO that's trying to come out and tell people to stop rioting, or as like the Social Democratic Party intervening to, suppress the actual revolution when it happens. Um, so this is like a very classic problematic of revolutionary organization is how to balance between those two poles. And we see there's a couple of things I think that we can track when we do this daily work, right? One of the things is I think we have to also imagine and put ourselves in the shoes of these people who we maybe even know personally, or we are posed as enemies in a particular kind of upsurge, right? These people who came out of a previous upsurge, like the anti-globalization movement or something like that, or New Left organizing in the US, and then they gain these positions of power through that daily organizing community level, like NGO stuff, local governmental stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And they build these service organizations. And then when they are confronted with the new upsurge, they oppose it, right? I think we actually have to think about what they're doing in their head sometimes to understand where those errors come from, where those rightist deviations originate. And the reason is that it helps us better identify what are the tendencies in that daily work that can lead to that sort of outcome. And you end up being in the organization that is then suppressing their, revolutionary upsurge. And I think one of the key things that they are doing most of the time is they're thinking in these terms of self-preservation of their formal organization, right? They're thinking this uprising is happening. I have this network, or I have this capacity, this mutual aid project, or this NGO that does all this service work among migrant workers, or I have this, X, Y, and Z. And they're thinking, well, if I put my full weight into this and mobilize it, it's going to get destroyed, basically. And they're right. Right. If they have a mutual aid network that does a bunch of, I don't know, a community, a food pantry, whatever, and they go and they organize that mutual aid network to systematically loot businesses and to give that food to people in the uprising and, redistribute all that thing. Right. If they do that, they will become a criminal organization. They will be destroyed by the state unless it happens to actually be the revolution, in which case they become the Ministry of Commerce or whatever for the revolution, right? And there's no, in most of our cases, it's not even a question that there's going to be a revolution. They know they will be destroyed because it's the social kind of level is not that advanced. They know they will be destroyed. And so there's this idea that they'll be sacrificing everything that they've built, right? But then anyone who's really retained fidelity to the communist project knows that they're not sacrificing everything, right? They are adding fuel to the flame, which will then generate new things, even if it destroys their particular formal thing, right? There is no revolutionary example where the party that existed, the formal party that existed, before it didn't like somehow split or destroy half of it or get two-thirds wrecked, right, by the state in the process of revolution. So even when they're successful, right, you then have like the split between the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, or you have this devastating long civil war induced by betrayal of poor strategy because Russia told the Chinese Communist Party to ally itself with the nationalists, and the nationalists betrayed them, right? You always are seeing these evolutions and adaptations happen through these kind of violent bottlenecks of that very formal activity of the movement itself, this threshing of those formal parties, right? And that is a generative process, even if it's painful and destructive. So I think that's one of the key things to kind of watch out for is these organizations that become so self-obsessed that they would rather sacrifice the revolution to themselves, right, than sacrifice themselves as an organization for the sake of that larger kind of revolution. But then the question, the real partisan question is how do you retain that integrity of like intelligent formal action? And part of the thing that I really emphasize is the idea that understanding this larger communist movement as irreducible. It can't be reduced to a particular formal party. It's the sum of all these formal parties. So even if yours might actually get destroyed, there will be others, and you should already be working in this way that is that where everyone is moving in that same kind of direction, that same momentum, while also being wary of like these ones making these rightist turns that then become your enemies. So in terms of concrete day-to-day organization, how do we bridge between these kind of insurrectionary moments, right? Now, the insurrectionary moment is absolutely essential. I don't know if, I mean, I think I made this clear, but I want to say in the masses piece, I talk a little bit about this. It's essential because it offers an intensive, conflictual, and massive kind of context through which politics and subjectivity is generated. It's intensive in the sense that it's like got these extreme forms of ethical commitment that are not reproduced in almost any other setting. Um, it is conflictual in the sense that it's obviously just a power conflict with capital, which also poses concrete questions of how to build power in a situation where capital is actually opposing you, right? And so it raises these kind of questions of like just concrete like military conflict, right? But also deeper levels of social, what is true social transformation, right? And then it's massive in the sense that any sort of class politics has to be a class politics. It can't be a minority intervention in the name of insurrection, right? It has to have these kind of massive aspects, and mass politics is expressed through these kind of eventual kind of upsurges. So in those three kind of respects, I talk about it more in that article. But if we talk about the concrete forms of organization in the moment, let's talk about like right now. The question that always gets posed in talks similar to this, or I would give other talks about, Hellworld stuff, and people are like, but what should we do? Right? Is the question. What should we do? And the first thing you have to say is, who the hell is we, right? Because people will talk in this royal we of like, we the left, we the global left, we the American left. And it's like, you don't have everybody's phone number. You can't even text all of them, right? You like much less mobilize all of those people. So you can't even ask this question. There is no we. Like you're not communicating to the American left in any of these kind of settings. Even if you're communicating to them, you have no command structure to make them do anything, right? There's this idea that you just throw your strategy out into the void and then people will do it. That's bullshit. You build an organization that can take tactical actions which progressively move toward that strategy. Like that's what organization is. And so the we is always like, who do you have? Who is that we and what are you doing together? What can you do together? Are you in the same city? Right? Are you not in the same city? Are you in the same country? Do you speak the same language? Right? Like what is this kind of we that we're talking about in the day-to-day kind of situation? And in most cases, we're talking about these small kind of grouplets that are probably pretty well distributed, maybe have small handfuls of people in particular cities, and in some cases, have some sort of link or operate within some sort of broader organizational milieu where maybe they could do some things, right? So the first thing is always when people are asking this, it's like you can do more if you have more people is one thing. And then if you have more people who are at a greater theoretical level of kind of understanding what the overall strategic direction is, then you can do even more because they have better understanding of what really needs to be done in the long term, right? It's rather than just maybe coming out to a like there's sort of everyday sort of unions who can just call people out to like maybe a march or a picket line or something, but they couldn't get people to do anything more than that, right? So like what kind of like what are your numbers? How militant are they in terms of theory and practice? And like, and also what is your situation? Are you living under a police state? What kind of police state, right? How severe is it? What can you say? What can you do? Are you open, et cetera, et cetera? Those things are all the really concrete questions that we have to ask. And when groups ask me that question, what should we do? I'll ask them about their specific situation, right? But there are some generalities that we can pull out from some of this. The first thing that I talk about extensively in Hellworld is the idea that politics, especially in these weird anti-political, like ANTE political situations, or pre-political situations, or these moments of kind of general nihilistic upsurge, especially in those conditions, politics are driven forward through tactical action more than discursive intervention, right? So you don't go and convince people like, oh, you're organizing wrong. Here's my program. Join me and we'll do something, right? And that something is always ill-defined. Instead, what you see is this is a theme that I take from military theory, where it's called the theory of competitive control. And it comes from observing these situations of like where areas have devolved into civil war and then examining why did so many people join Hezbollah, right? Or why did so many people join ISIS? Why did so many people join this one particular faction that doesn't seem on the surface of it to actually represent the ideological desires of the majority of the people there, right? So why do so many people get kind of thrown into these situations? And the key thing again and again and again is that they will join whoever demonstrates tactical competency, whoever is successfully able to overcome tactical limits, and who in some sense can kind of maybe invoke some of these general aesthetic themes in a competent kind of fashion, like basically who has good branding as well that can be distributed well. So who can summarize their positions concisely in like a visually appealing fashion and seems to have this attractive force for those sort of reasons. It's not about who you agree with initially. People will generally be relatively apolitical and they will eventually adopt the politics of whoever they align with in a very loose sense, right? Um, and the majority of people will never be hyper militant supporters of the thing, right? They will be passively militant at best, right? Like when you get kind of mobilized peasantry or whatever, they'll be passively militant. And that's usually just because they hate the other guys so much more. Um, that is the first thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that we need to be thinking in terms of these tactical interventions. And then this is also why the right wing has been so good at dominating so many individual situations, is because they were able to move into those spaces. Now, in some cases, like Hezbollah is a great example, they were able to move into those spaces because of Cold War repression of the Marxist groups that already had occupied some of those spaces, right? They were destroyed through active Cold War manipulation and invasion and dismantling and all this other shit going on, right? Um, or we're just in a bad situation, like you're in Hong Kong or in Ukraine, where the right is already just stronger for these structural reasons because of the geopolitics of the time, right? But at the same time, the right is making those advances through this kind of tactical logic, these tactical interventions. They're the first ones who break through that like ideological limit or whatever. I talk about in Hellworld how it was the localists, the far right localists, who broke with the civility of conventional Hong Kong politics and went and smashed the windows of the Legco, which is like their parliament, in 2014. And it was hugely unpopular among the conventional NGO liberal protester types, but it was hugely popular with the angry futureless youth, right? And then in 2016, they led this other series of these things called the fishball riots, and they continued to kind of build on this momentum. And then in 2019, right, they were in this position to tactically intervene again and again and again in these ways that kind of advanced elements of the struggle in their direction. Um, that's the first thing I think people have to keep in mind, is thinking of these tactical interventions and thinking of politics primarily as or initially as tactical, right? And that these programs and stuff are secondary to those tactics, which isn't to say that they're completely unimportant, right? It becomes important to discursively explain what communism is and build out our theoretical understanding of social transformation and build up background organizations capable of doing larger kind of actions and fighting these battles that we think that we will fight in the future. So that stuff is all important. Now, if we back up a little bit again to our current situation, what other sorts of organization, right, are we really talking about? One of the other things is that no one seems to be very successful at this point, which means that no one's plan is necessarily a good one until it's proven to work, right? The thing about Bolshevism or whatever wasn't that it had a really good program and people liked it. It's that a lot of people looked at it and said, well, they won a revolution, right? How did they do it? And then everyone tried to emulate it, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of is one of the primary sources of kind of authority for communists, right? Is that practical proof of action, even if it was really had a bunch of incidental factors like Russia did, right? Which then the subsequent attempts to emulate it proved would actually fail in other conditions. Um, so how do we then translate that reality into our day-to-day work, right? Well, we have to be experimental is the first thing. If no one really knows exactly what the path to revolution is, you have to be experimenting with multiple things. You can't say, I know it's going to be this way and this is my strategy, and you can't do anything else. So this very core feature of a lot of these kind of decrepit sectarian democratic centralist orgs that really try to align everyone with a particular strategic path, right? They're making an initial very serious error by reducing the experimentation. Now, at the same time, right, there's these other organizations that are going to be experimenting, and everyone will be kind of watching, and whoever is experimenting the best is going to get more attention, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's a risk of deviation there in opportunistic senses of like you win one battle, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're the best, right? So there's all these risks in it, but we have to be experimental, right? So you have to be experimental tactically with what you're doing, with the forms of organization that you're using. And you have to encourage that experimentalism at a larger scale. So the other principle is being ecumenical. Ecumenical in the sense of, I think, is a little bit more positive than when people say being non-sectarian, right? I think actually we should be sectarian in the sense of being against sects, right? Against this entire logic of a sect with a line then excludes, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to be ecumenical in the sense of encouraging people to explore theoretically and tactically and figuring out collectively maybe where we set the limits of those ecumenical kind of boundaries, because being ecumenical is always this kind of conflict. And if we think of ecumenical in like the church sense, right? It's like, okay, well, who's within the same religion within this ecumenicism, and then who's maybe within the same broad spirit of humanity within this larger ecumenicism, and then who's like really close to us within the same, current religious current or whatever. Like, I think we have to be thinking sort of in those terms. So what that leads to is the idea, and this is particularly important, is when we take all these things together, this kind of tactical action forward, experimentation, ecumenicism, it means that a lot of forms of kind of pre-political organization actually become much, much more important than explicitly political party building in the classical sense, where if you build these platforms for people to just come together in general and maybe experiment with different radical projects, for people to just have social interaction with other people vaguely interested in radical ideas who came out of an uprising together, right? You build these platforms and these social fields for people to interact is far more important, especially initially, for this process of formal organization over time. And we also see that especially in this kind of moment of more nihilistic type of uprisings or pre-political uprisings, um, you see that these apolitical, sometimes even seemingly anti-political organizations actually become more and more essential to the actual uprising itself, right? So you see like just these random, seemingly random groups that become fundamental features of like the uprising because of the nature of the uprising or something like that. And classic examples are like the football ultras in the Arab Spring. But we can find a bunch of other kind of examples in all these different cases where it's just like this one social group seems like just really into it for some reason, like this one occupational group. They just got really into the revolutionary kind of upsurge. Maybe it affected their livelihoods in some particular way, or maybe they were just a combative subculture. And now they get to be combative at a larger scale and train people how to fight the police, which they've already been doing. Or maybe they just have some sort of capacity that they've been wanting to put into to use some sort of positive kind of capacity in terms of mutual aid stuff, right? Like you'll see all kinds of random, seemingly kind of pre-political things take on these new kind of political functions. Um, so in that regard, organizing at this pre-political level is very important, giving people these social kind of feels, organizing these kind of more open, assembly structures have been really big in the US recently in terms of just getting people in like neighborhoods into like these assemblies where they at least talk to people because it overcomes this base level of atomization that we kind of deal with some of these structural limits, but also just across these kind of leftist subcultures, and making these kind of ecumenical spaces where it's like, one of the problems with organizing in a lot of places is there'll be these social events, right? But the social event is always just a front for some organization, and everyone kind of knows it. And you'll go if you're sort of interested in the organization, or if you're really naive and you don't know anything about it. But then everyone else gets turned off by it because they're like, oh, yeah, this is like a recruitment event for this group, right? And then they think ahead of time, like, I'm not interested, they don't want to go. But having these genuinely ecumenical kind of spaces for that sort of thing um, and then having these other kind of capacity building things, especially when you're at a higher level of organization, being able to have things like educational infrastructure that is, again, ecumenical, that isn't just training to go into your organization, running things like trade schools, language schools. These things were so important to the historical communist movement, right? They were the beginning point of almost all of the big, formal parties that we would think of, right? They came out of this open scene of organizing in, sports clubs and language schools for newly arrived migrants and like all this stuff. That's really where they develop kind of from. And rebuilding that sort of infrastructure becomes then it kind of builds the soil structure for your larger formal organizations. So that's where I usually kind of point people toward those sort of solutions. Also, this general idea of like social atomization, ethical striving that people have. I think a lot of people are sometimes like turned off by the idea that communism has these kind of religious overtones and stuff. But I think actually that's something that should be embraced. People are looking for these forms of like community and ethical commitment and stuff that they usually only like in the US, especially where I am now in like the South in part of the Bible Belt. And actually, I'm in the buckle of the Bible Belt. They go to church. That's the only place they find it because that's the only place that's offering it as well. Like they may not even be that interested in any of the church shit, and they certainly aren't, on average, interested in the crazy right-wing dominionist Christian shit that they're being sold in these places. But they're interested in this. They have this ethical striving. They want to overcome social atomization, and there are no outlets for it, especially in this American context. And so any kind of communist organization that can fulfill some of that need, right? Um, like literally just make a church and call it the Church of Communism and invite people to come and get the tax breaks. And you can do whatever else you want out of the building or whatever, but like I think we have to again be experimental, be thinking of it in these kind of terms, be seeing kind of what's effective tactical interventions from kind of across the board, and be really willing to kind of uh, not again be non-sectarian in that kind of wishy-washy way, but be ecumenical in this positive way of trying to build up everyone's critical thought and everyone's tactical intelligence and everyone's support networks for when repression happens and all of that stuff.
I think Renzo wants to speak.
Um, hey, Phil, Phil was uh really great hearing you. I guess I wanted to hear a bit more on, like, I mean, Hinterland has been on my reading list, but I haven't yet read it. But I wanted to hear a bit more on. I'm interested in this. Uh, how much of this of your reading of the conjuncture in terms of the recomposition of the social space that you see in the US, but also in the world. How does this more concrete analysis uh, has consequences for this more abstract theory that you've been fleshing out? Because on some moments it feels that you're trying to describe some more kind of broadly historical kind of sequences, and that these descriptions are fulfilled by all of this, but there are some moments that it feels that you are deriving them from more like a concrete situations. For example, um, because I think also in Brazil we have this sensation of how the insurrections, the cycle of struggles that we've been through have gone through this. Uh, but how I think on our side, like it feels that um, a lot of the challenges beyond this kind of classical, like ascension and descension and all this more traditional dynamics that play into insurrections and revolts. Uh, a lot of them seems to have to do uh, by, I think, at least two conditions. The first one that I think your work has is this kind of heterogeneity of the social space, of the amounts of divisions uh, that we find more and more, and this kind of fragmentation of the social space. And it made me wonder whether, for example, this principle that this idea of the formal irreducibility of organization, which I think it vibes a lot with the things we've been discussing in CSO. Whether do you think these two things are connected? Whether from the this social heterogeneity, it makes sense, it makes more sense to think politics through a irreducibility of forms approach, or whether you think that's been true. I mean, it's maybe both, right? It's been true all along for the whole time, but now it's more visible as a kind of problem, like how you actually connect this formal irreducibility across organizations in a kind of politically cohesive space. And the second thing that I was the second character, which I think, because like you mentioned, on one hand the subsistence struggles, and on the other hand the importance of tactics. I feel there's a dimension that we've experienced uh, a lot in the struggles, which is it's not just the subsistence of the subsistence struggles, but the subsistence of the struggles. And if I think it feels to many of us that it's not that there is a limit to the tactical aspect. Like, there you can be as inventive as you want. At some point, there's this other aspect that maybe like we maybe has to do with something like logistics, like how you create this infrastructure, which I think, to me, feels that it's irreducible to the tactical aspect. So I wanted also to hear if you think that makes sense, uh, because yeah, it feels like there's these characteristics that are proper to our times that haven't been as visible in other struggles. So yeah, I wanted to hear more of you on this, and your specific view on, analysis that you discuss in Hinterland and other texts. Like, how do you think that your theory of the party relates to kind of more social dynamics of contemporary uh, day?
Yeah. Um,
Can I add something real? real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
And so, and there is this thing that I'm curious because I'm quite confident on what the formal parties must do. Like you must just follow the flow and just go in. But there is this feeling that the capital has turned himself itself in some form of omnipresent God and omnipotent God. So I can see how some conflict in Brazil, maybe if it even if it spreads all the way through Brazil, and I don't see how it can go through the planet because we have the deindustrialization problem, we have the revolution of the logistics. So it looks like the communist movement is some kind of disease, and it's trying to kill an organism that is quite effective on killing us. So I think that like we have this flow that we have to go and like just go in it, you know? But it seems to be pretty localized, and language and local conflicts seems to be the pretty strong barriers. Sorry for the pretty weak English, but I guess it, it was good. Okay.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I'll kind of answer them roughly in the order they were asked. We have one other hand up. Do we want to put that on last or just add it on? What do you want to do, Raphael?
I don't know, Geronimo, do you think it is like in the same subject or just to understand what's bad?
I think maybe Phil, if you want to take those two questions, that would be good. And then if there's time, I don't know if you guys want to wrap up soon, then I can jump in quick.
That sounds good.
But
Yeah,
maybe
we
those two
can.
questions have a lot, so you can give them their own time.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll just do them kind of roughly in order. The first question about kind of the fragmentation, does it kind of orient us maybe more toward this formalization or this understanding of kind of like uh, the irreducibility of kind of formality, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a certain extent to which um, it is the case. I talk a little bit about this toward the end of kind of Hellworld, where it talks about how, in fact, in dismembering and kind of reinventing and accumulating kind of this history of failures, the development of the forces of production themselves do in this kind of weird and backwards way sort of encourage more and more of this awareness of the communist kind of potential, but in the negative and of like the form determination of things, and it directs things more toward like basically we can also think of it as like there are so many other kind of revolutionary attempts that fail in these particular ways. These sort of half measures get disproven through the history of revolution. And then we kind of get more and more pushed toward an awareness of the real extent required of kind of changing social forms, but also because things do get dismembered in this particular way, that a lot of given forms of communality kind of no longer can serve as these mass level organizers of the revolution when it happens. So then it can't really take those easy forms, like the easy forms of nationalism that it used to take. It can't really take today in almost any case. Like when it's tried to, it immediately collapses because it's so evident that that internal national body is riven against itself, and it's riven against itself because of the division of labor, right? So, um, so that's one of the key things. The other thing with regard to kind of how, the hinterland kind of aspect, or these, we could think of maybe as these structural aspects sort of relate to the more abstract aspects, and the fact that sometimes I'm talking in these registers of kind of immediate right now, organizational questions, and sometimes at this higher level of um, things that subsist at maybe the level of like the whole development of history, right? Generally, especially for theories of like for political philosophy. I think of the theory of the party as this higher level abstract thing that applies in all these conditions. And then when I'm talking about theories of organization, it usually has to get more granular, and we're talking about specific, tactical kind of interventions or specific forms of organization, or like what particular moments are maybe best suited for et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of divide it as a lot more of the theory of the party stuff talks at this high level of abstraction, whereas theories of organization engage a lot more with the conjunctural aspects of a particular structural situation. So we might have some general theories of organization, like the idea that revolution maybe has to go through certain phases, and it will meet similar things. Like it will have, you know, if you have an insurrection, that's not the end of it. Then you'll have, even if it's really successful, at best, you get a revolutionary civil war, and then you have to fight that, right? So like, there's these things that are going to be kind of recurrent and repeated features of organization. And then there's kind of these general level theories of kind of organization that are not necessarily political, but like theories of organization as such, whether they be theories of statecraft or whatever from ancient Chinese philosophy, or cybernetic theories of organization for contemporary stuff, right? So you can kind of talk about it in that level. When I'm talking about organization, I'm usually talking about like these specific kind of organizations of these collectives in the present. Um, there's one other thing I wanted to say with regard to that one. I think just that these specific conjunctural questions, these tactical limits, then also kind of induce and lead to these larger abstract theoretical questions, in the sense that like a lot of those problems in hinterland I was kind of raising out of being kind of thrown into this eventual conflict thing, and then also just in tracing out these very specific local structural trends of like, why do poor people now increasingly in the US live in suburbs rather than in the inner city, which was the traditional place where poor people lived in the US? I'm asking this very specific question, right? But that actually led to all of this sequence of subsequent questions that resulted in the project of Hellworld itself, which is like, I'm exploring these suburbs. So then I explore the industrial trends that led to the development of these suburbs, the logistics networks where they're clustered around these kind of new suburban working class neighborhoods cluster around these logistics complexes. Why are those logistics complexes where they are? It has to do with the Pacific Rim manufacturing network. So it has to do with industrial trends in China. So what do those look like, et cetera, et cetera. So then that leads me to this whole question of like the entire shifting shape of global industry, which then leads to these larger questions of capitalist development, the logic of capitalism at this kind of fundamental abstract level, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very intricately kind of related in that sort of sense. Um, uh, Hell World is also really where I address this second question as well that Felix raised of, it seems to be, capital seems to be kind of omnipotent. I call it like a demiurgic force. It's like godlike, right? And it initially seems very independent and increasingly independent of human activity, and that makes it seem very uh, impossible to overcome, right? But then the key thing that I try to do throughout Hellworld is also to demonstrate, and this is just kind of like what Marx does, right? Is every time he says, okay, well, these things sort of, these people are made to appear as things, and these things are made to appear as these abstract economic forces, right? That have this kind of higher level of independence and autonomy as an automatic subject, right? But then when you peel that stuff open, you find all this machinery of fixed capital, right? When you peel open like the money moving everywhere, you find the actual machinery of production and fixed capital. And then when you peel open the machinery of production and fixed capital, you find that it's people, right? It's people making everything run. It's a social form. And because it's a social form, it subsists from human activity. It subsists within human activity, right? So because of that, it means that those human interventions are the only thing that can kind of break it down. And even though it seems like any particular revolutionary cycle would get defeated because it's isolated, et cetera, et cetera. That is true, especially at smaller and smaller scales. And that's why I say like the uprising in Hong Kong was inherently going to be a tragic thing, right? Because there's almost no world in which it could have survived in any reasonable sense. Um, and that I think is going to be true for a lot of different scales of struggle. And we're going to have to pass through a lot of these failed insurrections at different scales until we get something that does enough damage where then it can build its own space of subsistence. And that gets back also to the other part of the first question, which is this kind of where is this limit of the tactical kind of limits? And I understand what you're saying. That it's kind of this limit of these kind of immediate tactical interventions. I would still understand it as just like a tactical limit at this larger kind of scale, in the sense of it's a sustained tactical difficulty that you're facing or an organizational difficulty. Maybe we should have, come up with like a third word for it because like this intermediate level, right? Between this immediate, easy, light tactical intervention, like smashing the windows of Parliament, and this larger tactical intervention, which we see in revolutionary history. It's like when you get the ability um, to really supply like an insurrectionary effort, right? You get these supply lines where you can funnel like guns to the insurrection, or you get these uh, Soviets in the countryside where you can supply food to the struggle, et cetera, or you get these readouts in the countryside, right? Um, and I think what we really need to find, this responds to both of those questions. So on the one hand, yes, we need these formal abilities to organize tactical interventions at this higher intermediate or mezzanine level where we get supply lanes to sustain things so that struggles can subsist for longer without also this tendency of burning out immediately, right? So how can we kind of modulate that energy that goes into them? How can we create these sort of systems of supply and support to do that? Are there any, and then that leads to this other question of what would our equivalents today of these longer term survival bases be, right? The classic kind of revolutionary camps and the things that were so important to historical revolutions, especially historical revolutions based that found these readouts in the countryside among the peasantry or in the mountains in the rebel camp or whatever. Like, what are the equivalents for us today? And I think that one's a lot harder. And that's just one of the really things where I think it's going to take an experiment to prove what it is, and it might be replicable. I think there's a couple of things we can say. One thing has to be, instead of just being distant, right? It has to be opaque in some different way. It has to not really be as clearly visible that that's what it is. And it's because it has to kind of hide in plain sight because of this pervasive, omnipresent power of capital and the fact that most of us live in effectively police states, right? And you can't just go into the countryside and run a rebel camp. Like it's easy to find on the satellite. There's some places where maybe you can do that a little bit, right? And there are examples of where they kind of still do it, in Kurdistan and the Philippines, whatever. But they're kind of very limited, very, very unique situations. And you absolutely could not do that in most cases. Now, that question writ large becomes the question that the second question that was asked, which is how would you then survive when you have this kind of localized insurrection that turns into a revolution, but then it sort of stops at a certain level of growth and it has to sustain itself, right? And I think this is where like all the like communization type theory really doesn't give enough credit to these classical questions of revolutionary organization that come from the Leninist tradition, because these basically just have to appraise this question of what happens when the revolution is proceeding and then it gets stopped and has to kind of wash back for a second. Then you get this question of socialism in one country. If not that, what else? How do you reignite things when everything else has been defeated? How do you sustain yourself when now you're surrounded and sanctioned by hostile powers? Maybe you won the Civil War, but you also have all these CIA agents trying to overthrow you all the time. Like those sort of questions, I think are very much more serious than is appraised in a lot of kind of contemporary like theory, high theory level kind of theory. And that's stuff that like reading those historical debates is very good. But at the same time, the conditions are also fairly different, right? Because you can't sustain yourself as easily because industrial systems are more complex. So how do you survive without these sort of things. What types of capacities do you have to build? How can you build those? That also entails you must organize among high training workers, like high skilled laborers, engineers, scientists, etc. It must be core elements of communist organizations. They always kind of have been in their own ways, but today it's even more important if you think you're going to be isolated and have to like, reconstruct a huge portion of an industrial system like that. You have to have that. And then how do you deal with the fact that some people have that expertise, others don't? You build up educational systems, but still that creates a power imbalance, classical kind of like Maoist problematics there. Um, yeah, let's get some of the other questions before we run out of time.
Yeah, am I good to go?
Yeah, just gonna ask Phil. I think we can do one last round if it's fine with you, just because we're like, so it's not too tiring. But yeah, please.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. I really appreciated this and I've appreciated your work. Um, I guess I have a question, or I'll start. I guess I appreciate in the your kind of other work that I've read of you that you have resisted this kind of totalizing periodization that we might read in some communization theory, like in Theory Communiste and maybe some of Jasper Burns and Joshua Clover, like how they just kind of render these maybe every form of organization that doesn't come like from seemingly like from the future at the immediate point of an upsurge or a riot as like everything else but that is appears as totally outmoded, which I think it's helpful to resist that. And yet at the same time, like something that I've been grappling with is this problematic that they do raise, in which maybe some of the more sophisticated moments in communization theory do invite us to think about the ways in which the certain sequences that these forms of organization find themselves in at the level of both kind of an organizational landscape and capitalist development in its course then go to overdetermine these organizations and set limits for them. So in thinking like how to square those two, right? To square the kind of communist content that might emerge out of struggles and then the limits that get imposed on them, or excuse me, get imposed on these organizations because of their own course within a certain context. Like I'm just not sure how, like where that vitality comes from, right? Like in Lenin, I mean, me and my friends just read Left Wing Communism, and you mentioned like Sylvan Lazarus, and we read a lot of like, I don't know, Lazarus. I think he writes about Lenin as being kind of animated by a negativity, right? This kind of fidelity to like insurrection in the last instance that allows him to be like, well, you can actually kind of still participate in elections, and you can also arm the workers when the time comes. But then we still kind of don't understand if that's kind of the only thing that we kind of have to hold on. Like, is there, like, can we think of organization with such a flexibility, provided we kind of hold on to this negativity hard enough? And then where might this negativity kind of come from, and how might we hold on to it? Or like, do certain forms kind of invite certain limits that maybe can't be like that maybe might need a new form, I guess I'm sorry if I haven't made much sense. I've been kind of thinking also on how to kind of describe this problem to myself. It's been racking me and my friends for a little while in our discussions, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, do we want to add some of the other questions on? I could just do them all at once like that. That's
Yeah,
a
I
great
think I think
question.
it yeah, I think it would be best. I'll try to put my question in simple terms. It's a bit related to something you said in the beginning. But I think it also connects to some of the concerns that Renzo mentioned because it's connected to a lot of the stuff we discussed. But from reading your work and also hearing you here today, a lot has cleared up. But also, I, I- there was a moment in your initial remarks where you talked about how there was this historical accumulation of struggles, and that they would in a sense, build on each other to allow for like better conditions for further developments. And you said well, there is something to discuss in this point that that you didn't develop because what I'm concerned is about that because from a certain sense, I might have misunderstood your work, but I sense that you are very aligned to something that we in Brazil generally call the peripherization thesis, which is the idea that in some which is that not only that the center is becoming a periphery in its social formation, it's becoming to look like the peripheries of global capitalism, but the fact that there is a disconnect between class structure and class experience. And I think that that's one of the problems why we cannot reenact the Russian or even the Maoist communist revolutions, because it seems that, and it's a problem I think that you point out with these different struggles, they are not spontaneously connected. And it's a lot to do with the fact that the logic of value does not seem to need this class experience composition to exist in the same way that it was necessary at some moment in capitalism. So in a certain sense, it seems like, of course, you are not simply there. It doesn't look from your perspective that there's a teleology that like we are just like following the development of capitalism. But at the same time, there was something that caught my eye when you were speaking, which was the contradiction that all communist-oriented organizations must face, which is they are all of them who come before communism will have to be destroyed in some sense. And that I was even thinking because you were talking about the opaqueness. It seems to be like that there's a need for a double opacity, a spatial opacity where like we were talking like you can't simply have out in the open the organizing of certain struggle logistics because it could be a target, but also there seems to be a temporal opacity where an organization has to understand itself as annihilable in the process. And it's interesting because what is accumulated? I think that's my question because I can understand and I agree completely with the fact that yeah, you can understand why some organizations tend to deviate. The rightist deviation. It's understandable. I mean, but at the same time, I think my question is, and this is a question which I'm posing like in a very interested manner, which is uh, this this puts another level of posing the problem of organizing because like you have to organize for your defeat in a sense. Uh, and I think I mean, it even seems like your book is like a catabasis, the narrative structure of a catabasis, uh, getting out of the hell world, not getting in. Uh, but that's my question. And I think we have one final question.
Hi. I think my question can come as a bit of basic, uh, but it's something that it's kind of unclear to me. Maybe it's something that you elaborate further in Theory of the Party, and I just haven't got to actually read it yet. But you cited both Badiou and Lazarus, and I've been trying to read the stuff they do on the theory of organization, and it seems to me that uh, they are posing a movement away from the traditional vanguard party structure, right? So um, when you are posing your theory of the organization, your theory of party, what I may maybe don't understand yet is if we are still talking about an organization in some form of cadre structure, of more closed off, or if we are talking about more of like in the sense of a mass movement, not necessarily a mass organization, but an organization that has this flexibility to engage with the masses. Because I think Badiou specifically talks about both the Zapatistas and the Nepalese Maoists as example or exploring forms of organization, and I get this doubt in my mind that is the way forward. Still, we need we need organization, we need militant discipline, but are we talking about some kind of more mass focus organization or some kind of still in a way still moved past what is the traditional form of the party, but still retaining the more closed off clandestine type of thing. That's my question, I guess.
Great. Um, okay. I took a little note so I could organize all of them. I'll again try to go roughly in order, but I'll probably jump back, especially to the first question. I think some of the elements will kind of get discussed throughout. It was asked in the first question. So, so one of the things is, yeah, against periodization. So I think that one of the things, I'm not really like necessarily opposed to periodization. I think that there's good periodizations which are just sort of functional and well defined about like exactly what they relate to what you're talking about, but they're also periodizing about like very specific sort of functions and forms of organization or structure. So for example, there's there's a book by Scott Aquino and Stephen Mayer about American finance. It's called like Finance Capital in the 21st Century or something. And they do a periodization there. And their periodization is like, you had classical finance capital, and then you had this kind of managerial financial thing, and then you had the neoliberal type of finance capital, although they don't call it that. They call it like, I think like a market oriented or market driven or something like that. And then you have this kind of new finance capital. And in most other settings, I think that people would basically be talking out of their ass when they said that sort of thing. But for them, they actually define it really well. And they're like, look, we're periodizing about like these specific structures about how finance and the fiscal architecture of the US is designed, that it has these inflection points where it shifts and then it stabilizes around this new kind of form that has these particular institutions. That sort of periodization makes a lot of sense. And what they really aren't doing is saying, well, you have finance capitalism, right? And it's different than classic industrial capitalism. And that's different than, they're saying like these are specific periods of the development of American financial system. That periodization makes a lot of sense. Now, the most dangerous types of periodization, in my opinion, are the ones that do what I was just kind of making fun of, is where you have like, oh, you had this one type of capitalism and now you don't have it anymore. You have this new neoliberal type of capitalism, but now, oh no, neoliberalism is dying. So you have a new type of capitalism. It's state capitalism, or it's neo-feudalism, or it's, the idea that with every shift of the winds, with every geographic transformation in the structure of industry, you suddenly have transformations at the fundamental levels of social organization and the fundamental abstract logic of the social system. That is the periodization that I think is really, really dangerous. Now, why do people do that? They do it because they're academics and it makes them money. It makes them have job security because they get a bunch of citations. Because if you put an adjective in front of the word capitalism, then other people will cite your adjective capitalism and you will get like your academic rating pumped up. And it's a great strategy for if you're trying to do that and build an academic career. That's what you need to do. You're forced structurally to do it. You don't have any choice, right? Now, in between those kind of extremes, I think a lot of people do it innocently as like a propagandistic measure because it's also very effective in that respect. People who have a hard time like starting a book, for example, or starting an argument in like an article, one of the easiest ways to start it is things used to be this way, but now they're not. That's a classic, right? We used to have mass unions and parties, and they organized with the working class, and now we don't. We have different movements about feminism and about gender and about all this other stuff. We have specific communal interests and racial issues and all these, uh, those sort of arguments are maybe justifiable in certain propagandistic settings, but in general, they're very dangerous, I think. And I think a lot of people who use them don't really believe them, and you push them on that, and they're like, oh, yeah, well, the Keynesian era was really complicated. And you're basically saying like none of the shit that you said was true, but they'll say like, well, yeah, you're right. It didn't really work like that. They're playing kind of a dangerous game, I think, because then people take that at face value and it turns into a vulgarized form of like those like whatever, sociology 101 or political economy 101. This is Keynesianism, this is neoliberalism, right? Um, so those sort of things I think are very dangerous. Now, the other thing, though, is that there's something about novelty that the reason that those are effective propagandistically is that there's something about novelty that really gets people going. They want to think that their whole thing is new and cool and all that, right? Um, and so there is a power to invoking novelty in many of these arguments that does get people behind you, and they makes them think like, yeah, what we're doing is kind of unprecedented or something, or it's a break with the norm, right? Um, and that maybe comes out of the idea of this, they want to generally oppose the social order. So anything that seems genuinely new is then very attractive. But then, it gets metastasized into this idea of just obsession with whatever seems novel, basically. An obsession with whatever the new organizational form is, whatever the new organizational branding is, whatever the new way of just like talking about organization is, right? All of these things kind of combine together to create this tendency, I think, that we see with like periodization, with this obsession with particular organizational forms, with whatever is the most kind of new in any of those respects. Um, so in because that's the situation that I'm sort of speaking within, that's the context or the environment of so much radical writing, and especially kind of theory side radical writing, I really emphasize the opposite part, which is invariance. The fact that we're in the same struggle that we were in 150 years ago, or the fact that we can learn from those struggles in very, very similar ways even if we can trace some ways that things have changed, which I'll talk about in a second, um, we still see and draw out organizational lessons from these previous struggles, right? In capitalism, even before capitalism, these peasant, millenarian peasant revolts, general theories of organization, all kinds of parts of this vast kind of history. Um, we have to emphasize that kind of invariance. And then we also have to emphasize like the invariance of the social logic of capital that doesn't just change. It doesn't, because if it just changed, it would be fairly easy to gradually nudge it in the right direction, which is the whole program, right, of like social democracy reformism in the classic sense. You can just sort of nudge it and make it a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, and then eventually it's no longer capitalism, right? It turns from neoliberal capitalism to a new, happier Keynesianism to a somewhat almost socialist thing to a lower stage of socialism to, you could then do that. And one of the fundamental things, again, kind of an invariant fact of communist struggle is that you can't do that. The capitalism has its own, the social logic of capitalism has an inertia, it persists, it reproduces itself. It has mechanisms to reproduce itself. And that is why it doesn't just collapse. It doesn't gradually fade away. It has to be destroyed, right? Um, so those are, I think, some of the important kind of orienting things. Now, the question of kind of Lenin and negativity and stuff, I think on the one hand, it is negativity. It is a faith. It's kind of like an apathetic faith. Apathetic meaning like you can't describe God, right? Like you can only describe God in the negative. Any attempt to describe God or view or portray the face of God will not work. It will inherently, just by definition, not work. So I think there is this apathetic feature to communist struggle and to the communist organization where even if your organization is good and doing great stuff and you're really excited about it, you're always going to have this kind of negative view of like, but it could and should be better. It could and should be more capable of initiating these incendiary conflicts. It's held back by this and this. And so you're kind of thrown into this sort of Leninist stance of being constantly polemical and talking shit about everyone and everything because nothing matches up, right, to that kind of negative view of faith in this insurrectionary potential to perform social transformation. And then once social transformation has been performed, has been initiated in the revolutionary sequence, then you still have that negativity. You have that negativity carried forward through your attempts to uh, uh, confront the falling short of the new revolutionary society and the dangers that it faces and have it survive, but also continue to be revolutionary. And then you have this self-revolutionizing dynamic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is an aspect where it is, negativity. But Lenin isn't just about negativity, right? That's, I think, the guiding kind of fire of it. But there's this other aspect of Lenin which gets, again, sort of metastasized and over obsessed because people think, well, he's saying you have to have this particular type of organization, democratic centralist organization. That's the only thing, and that's the playbook. Lenin himself doesn't really even say that, but that's something that people take from him, right? And that really gets encoded in history, especially through this Trotskyist type intervention. But the thing that Lenin says isn't you have to have this specific type of organization in all moments of history, et cetera, et cetera. He says you have to be organized, right? You have to be organized. It's an active effort to do this organizational thing, to build this capacity. If you want to act, you have to organize in order to act. Like I said before, if you have a strategy, it doesn't matter if you have it, you have to build something capable of taking these tactical steps toward that strategy. In order to do that, you have to have, organization, and not even just like thinking of political organization, partisan organization. You just have to have like organization, the ability to do things, right? The ability to enact your collective will or whatever, however it's decided. So that's, I think, the other kind of guiding thing. In addition to negativity, it's like be negative in this kind of pure apathetic sense, but also be disciplined, be organized, right? Be capable, be strong, right? Those are maybe the guiding things in between whatever type of organization it is. Um, I'll come back to a couple aspects of that, but I'll move on to the next part of the question of kind of the changing. There's maybe something kind of accumulated between these cycles of struggle from something that I was saying at the very beginning. I think that there's an important aspect here. So on the one hand, yes, I think there are some secular trends, and they have a certain effect, and I'll talk about them in a second. But specifically, I think we can just think of the fact that the historical party, the cadence of the historical party's motion of these uprisings and cycles of struggle and stuff, it's just uneven. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are more over time. It doesn't mean that they necessarily accumulate over time. I don't think they do. I don't think there's much evidence that they do. We have them whenever they have to happen, they sort of take maybe bigger scales just because there's everything is bigger, right? There's more people. Like a given insurrection today will include more people than there would have been in an insurrection 150 years ago because the population was smaller, right? So you do have bigger scales and complexity and some issues like that. But you don't necessarily see an accumulation of their size over time inherently. What you see in those secular trends is about more about like the idea that it becomes, like I said at the very beginning, one of the things that happens is it becomes kind of more and more absurd with the given amount of productive power, the lack and the inability of capitalist social organization to solve simple problems of like, hunger and things like that. When it becomes so obvious that it technically could. So it loses this old kind of thing that it could say, which is like, oh no, there's real scarcity, we just don't have enough food. And that was true in many places, right? When you had revolutions, they had to really deal with that problem. But there's a bunch of other, things that kind of become more and more aware for people. And so maybe that has an effect that makes some sort of revolutionary consciousness more likely. I sort of gesture at that toward the end of Hellworld. The other things that become the secular trends is that the reproductive infrastructure of society has to grow drastically just to facilitate social reproduction in general to facilitate production, suddenly you have to have way more people involved in these preliminary forms of social reproduction. It's visible in fields like education, healthcare, at this kind of conventional occupational level, right? But is also visible just at like when you think about the complexity of production itself, there's all these kind of extra activities that you do, infrastructural things that need to be in place, et cetera, et cetera. That I think does create this other tendency that's maybe at the where we find some of these positive aspects of what builds for revolutionary subjectivity. And I think that I've characterized before, um, in contrast to the older revolutionary narrative of communism as liberating the forces of reproduction, we really should think of communism as liberating the forces of reproduction, right? Liberating the forces of the ability to mobilize the forces of production, right, for these reproductive purposes, but also liberating this vast trove of reproductive skills that we have, the ability to take care of each other, to build our capacities, to build our collective intelligence, to educate people, to reskill people, right? Uh, Releasing those abilities out into the world and allowing them to actually like bud and take shape. And I think that's the real thing. Like if you look at strikes in the past, uh, I don't know, like even 30, 40 years in many places, like a lot of them are centered right on like education, healthcare. These are the big employment sectors. One of the things that you really see that really mobilizes people is this frustration where they're like, yeah, I signed on to be a mental health worker, or I signed on to be an educator in the schools, and I can't do it because of the structure of the job itself. Like they don't really want us to educate these kids. They don't really want us to provide people with mental health support. They don't really want us to take care of people's bodies as healthcare workers, to institute systems of preventative care and social care that are needed to prevent like diseases of poverty, right? That you would see in any endocrinologist office in any city in the world, right? Um, that's, I think, very mobilizing for people, and that's going to become more and more so. So there are some secular trends, and if I think that they are in that sort of field rather than in the field of maybe the cadence of struggle. Um, the other part about the class structure versus the class experience, on the one hand, yeah, it's true. Class structure and class experience, they are divorced, right? But I also think that this is one of those things that we've inherited from some of those tendencies to periodize in particular ways, where we mythologize the past and over exaggerate the connection that used to exist between class structure and class experience. I think there are periods where maybe there was a little bit more of a connection, but there is no period where it really approximates the myth that we are told about how the workers' movement operated. There is no period where it did. If you look back, especially like before 1920s, 1930s, you start to look back 1910s, 1890s, 1880s, 1870s, 1860s, you see conditions that are so much more similar to those today than they even are to that kind of mid-century point that people point to. And then it also makes you realize that many of those correlations between class structure and class experience that seem to be produced by the forces of production themselves, the organization of production, the gathering together of people into these mass factories, they were in fact also equally, perhaps more so, a product of the revolutionary movement itself cohering that subject, cohering that class experience as a class for itself, and cohering it as a class in itself, conscious of that, you know. I think those things kind of get exaggerated because a lot of even those employment structures that we think of are classic, they were forced by violent, extensive rioting by workers to change the structure of the wage so that they could have a more formal income, a more formal wage structure that gave them a steady income. And that destroyed a lot of just the sort of like dock hand labor pool type structures where people just stand around until someone called them into the factory that day, right? Because they needed work. Those things were intentionally destroyed through strike action, through workers' riots, through all these kinds of interventions. They were likely assisted by needs in the development of the forces of production for this brief period, but also like they weren't just induced by the fact that we needed mass production. We had mass production before without those things, without a really formal wage, without good, you know, good labor relations systems. Like we had mass production prior to that. It wasn't just mass production that created those things. And then we also now have mass production today without those things, and it still works, right? So it's not a structural need. So I think that's the big thing is that it originates out of that stuff I was talking about kind of earlier. Um, the briefly the comment on catabasis, yeah, that is the intent of the book is to be kind of a catabasis, and it's not just being immersed in Hell World, but it's also not just escaping it, right? Because catabasis isn't just escaping it or going beyond it; it's passing through it in order to go beyond it. And so that is the structure of the book. Um, the question of opacity, kind of like what. So there's this need to be kind of opaque. There's this also this need to kind of sacrifice in this fire of negativity, even our formal content. But then how can we understand what is being preserved beyond these kind of moments? If your formal organizations are being dissolved and reborn, how can we understand what's being kind of reborn and what's being carried on? So on the one hand, we can think of it at this historical scale of like, well, we had a large workers' movement in Germany that set the stage of the German Social Democratic Party, right? And then they tried to replicate it in Russia in these other conditions with some other inputs, like from the populist movement, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but then in so doing, they also ended up basically destroying that structure as they inherited it and inventing something new from it. And nonetheless, we can see a continuity between those things, right? We can see that communist project being carried from the early German social democratic workers' movement to the Russian Bolshevik revolutionary movement. And then we see the same thing happening again when it moves elsewhere into these peasant revolts and peasant armies that be great, the Chinese Revolution, the Revolution of Vietnam, these post-colonial conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so we can see continuities and we definitely see it. And then we can also even recognize that when it dies out and comes back, we can somehow recognize that. And I think this has to do with whether like how this is a kind of a philosophical question at this very fundamental level of like metaphysical question of things, processes, structures, et cetera, et cetera. What are we talking about when we talk at this kind of level of like stuff, right? um I think that it just demonstrates how the real kind of motive force, not just in this case, but like I would say in the universe, is not these kind of content container objects. It's also not these processes necessarily. It's these dynamic form structures, essentially. I don't really have time to get into it, but I would say like philosophically, I would draw from obviously like the history of kind of like dialectical kind of thought, but also like more specifically and in contemporary philosophical parlance, the like ontic structural realism and this particular type of naturalism that follows from it. If you want to look up ontic structural realism, you can see where that is. I think it relates also fundamentally to this debate, which is great that you guys are reading this stuff on category theory and whatnot, because I think fundamentally the open question with ontic structural realist questions is this philosophy of math thing, and it's category theory or set theory or both, and how. Anyways, the point is just that it's structures, right? Things are structures. There are not actually things. Things are just these weird pragmatic ways we have of talking about structures, and it structures all the way down. And these structures are dynamical. They're patterns. They're in the Chinese philosophical tradition called Li. Um, uh, which means all kinds of things, pattern, coherence, et cetera, et cetera. And they're traceable through in the Chinese tradition, Tao, these kind of lines of flight, but also through these kind of processual kind of performances, these processual methods. Anyways, that's getting a little bit into the weeds of the kind of philosophy. But the point is that we can see even when we sacrifice some of that content and we shed it, we can see continuities of structure and form beneath it because what we're really tracing is this content and kind of form thing and maybe changes, maybe even accumulations or changes in these kind of structures over time. If we think of it like from biology, we can think of species, right? Obviously, species are changing, but at the same time, there's a lineage, and we can trace that lineage. And the changing maybe it can is has a teleological structure to it in the sense of, I don't know, increasing complexity, increasing information levels, decreasing local entropy, increasing global entropy, like that sort of thing. But you can trace something is the point, even between these changes in like inflection points between species, you know. Um, so we have this kind of evolutionary long run kind of thing, but it is punctuated. Um, and then the final question about Badiou and these organizational suggestions, I don't think so. Ultimately, the simple answer is just that I don't think that Badiou's organizational suggestions are very good. Um, he's kind of drawn in a bunch of different directions, and I think he's basically stopped doing a lot of organizational stuff fairly early, partially just because of the tides of history, but also, you know just this level of the the intensity of his philosophical project kind of required that he commit that amount of time to not doing, organizing, which is fair. It's fine. But I think it does mean that his organizational suggestions are not the best. They're not super bad, but I think that he makes a bunch of key mistakes and inconsistencies in his different organizational suggestions. So you'll often see him suggesting at different periods of his career. He'll suggest things like, well, we have to find like whatever special demographic group most represents the placelessness, right, of this kind of roving singularity or whatever. And then he turns to kind of like the status of migrant workers. There's this whole period in his political writings where he's really obsessed with undocumented migrant workers. And it's just a temptation to do a very similar thing to what I began with to kind of bring the discussion full circle of find a special demographic. And again, I disagree with this idea that there is a special demographic. Um, at the same time, he does a bunch of other things, and they're inconsistent, his organizational kind of questions. Because yeah, he names all kinds of shit as examples of what he thinks organization should be, and they're very diverse and very different, right? So he talks about Nepal, he talks about the Zapatistas. If that was it, it would be consistent. He would be kind of a third worldist of some sort, right? But then he also talks about, yeah, these basically NGOs for migrant support work in France. He talks about just kind of random, kind of incidental stuff in these kind of wealthy countries like squares movements type stuff. He talks about the Arab Spring extensively, I mean, it's just sort of this grab bag of stuff that you can't really tease a whole lot out of. What you can tease out of it is, I think the real kind of core lesson is this idea that he's very good at emphasizing that the difficulties of Marxism have to do less with like Marxism itself or with Marx's writing, but with the fact that so much of like Marxism today is constructed on the rejection of like the incendiary aspect of the communist project. And it can't quite uh, critique itself in this sort of way. Um, in terms of the specific kind of organizational kind of questions, yeah, I think we have to have these kind of opaque and militant organizations. When I talk about formal parties, though, I'm talking about a very wide variety of activities that will include things that have kind of a cadre style structure, but it's not reducible to that. It'll include a lot of other things, open sort of things, even traditional like vanguard parties or whatever. Um, the ones that actually existed in history and did anything, they also had this mass element, right? They were constantly, they lived through engagement with the masses. Again, this Substack essay I have up called Masses talks about this kind of relationship, but they only lived through that engagement, right? Um, and that was codified in the Maoist terms as like the two-line struggle and the having like one foot in kind of the mass line and one foot in the party line, that sort of thing. But the idea is that a lot of these cadre organizations and formal parties that exist today or imagine themselves to exist, um, they are actually these kind of like ossified structures that aren't really partisan in any respect because they have turned inward to such an extent that they're just these weird little decaying sects. And they are so exclusive, right, that they actually lose that partisan ability and they just turn into kind of these bickering old people essentially in the end. Um, but I think one of the key things is understanding that what most people think of and talk about as cadre organizations or as vanguard organizations today don't look anything like the historical cases of those exact organizations before. They bear almost no resemblance to them, either in how they are actually organized or in how they are uh, interacting with mass struggle, right? I think we have to distinguish when we talk about engaging with this history of organizational political philosophy questions. Um, we read all this stuff from the past. We have to think about, well, why was it written? Why were they writing it? At what level was it intended? Was it just a polemical intervention? Was it a general theory of revolutionary organization? Was it something in between? Um, how are they describing their organization, right? But also, is their description of how their organization works actually how their organization worked? Because it almost never is. It's like this ideal case of like Lenin is saying, well, we should organize like this. But then you actually look at the how it operated, like it did not work like that, right? So you get these various levels, but what happens is that people today, they look at those documents, they take them completely out of context, and they treat every single one as a universal prescription for how to create a revolutionary organization, a revolutionary cadre organization, right? And I think that's the big difficulty. Um, so yeah, I think that kind of basically covers pretty much all the territory. Um, and yeah, if you want more detail, like it was said at the beginning, you can kind of take a look at these kind of random things I put up on the Substack. The Substack is also useful if you want to see like a bibliography with links to all the articles that I've written and the books and all that stuff. Um, Other than that, I'll have this article on organization coming out in Heatwave magazine. I think will be the next article thing I have out, and it touches on a lot of these questions a little bit more specifically. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Uh, I mean, I think it's as we said, that was the last round of questions, and I mean, we've been here like for I think 2 hours and a half. So I think it's we really managed to cover a lot of ground. So I'd like to thank you for coming over, for having a chat with us. I hope there might be other opportunities in the future. And just want to thank everyone for coming. And I think that's it. I mean, unless anyone has any parting words, I think we're done for tonight.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again for having me on.
Okay, so see you all in the next time. Bye bye, everyone.